Time of the year, winter time. Air's a bit drier. A little bit of background. There are a number of pieces of legislation. I have a tendency to walk as well, so in case some people can't hear me on this side, then I'll walk on the other side as well. There are a number of different pieces of legislation available to municipalities and townships on how they want to address trees. The key operative word I'd like to emphasize is addressing trees. There's protections, there's replanting, there's maintenance. It's just how you address them and what do you decide to do with them and when. So there are various different tools available. We're going to focus primarily on heritage trees at this point in time. At any point in time, if you have a question, please ask it. Does that sound fair? There's no point in holding on to an idea and not listening to the rest of what's going on, I find, at least in my case. We've got a number of opportunities, as Edith had mentioned. There's a number of criteria of different types of trees and tree settings that can be adapted to the Heritage Act. As you can see, there's heritage conservation districts. Are many of you familiar with heritage conservation districts? No. They're a planning opportunity in an area that the community feels that's very significant and has a unique character. It's up to council and the residents to decide what the criteria is relating to that. And as I say earlier, there's a number of different components. We've got the criteria that come down here. These are the typical things that are used. One of these would be necessary to designate it under the Heritage Act. We've got size, form, shape, much to what Edith had indicated on the form that she had shown, all the different characteristics. Beauty, rarity, cultural interest, cherished and recognized. Again, trees are here much longer than we are generally. So it's about cherishing and recognizing for future generations. Under the Heritage Act, this is all technical stuff that it just says you need one criteria out of the 9 to get it into the conveyor belt to try and get it recognized. So it doesn't have to go through all 9 criteria, just one out of the 9. A key point to understand. Cultural heritage, as you can see, it's relating to a human, shall we say, interaction at some point in time with the tree or the area around the tree. That's a synopsis of what you're trying to identify. It's about people and tree. Why is it important? Generally, we like to try and maintain the character of our communities. Even though there's outside pressures for change and, shall we say, moving forward is some of the terms that they use, or change or progress. There are opportunities, as there is a mention there of tourism. If you have something that's very unique, that's different from everybody else, there's tourism opportunities in that respect. And there are investments. There are investments that at some point in time in the society that we're living in now, at some point somebody probably planted a tree somewhere on a property. So we all benefit from it. When it has cultural value, a cultural demonstration, it's usually part of something bigger. There's a lot of farmsteads in King Township, and they may have had a lot of trees planted when the farms were established. So subsequently, the owners of those properties could be a factor in terms of the cultural recognition. Design value, it could be something unique. Has anybody been to Parkwood in Oshawa? McLaughlin's estate? There would be a typical sort of landscape that would really meet that criteria. I had the opportunity of working at the estate back in the 70s, working on their English garden. They had a Carolina poplar hedge at the end of the garden, so it was the backdrop to the stonework in front. The hedge was 45 feet tall though. So you're sitting up on top of the stump with a pruner, a pole pruner, chopping all the sucker growth off the top. It was an interesting affair. It's quite the place back in the 70s even, when he was alive. But there are, again, there could be architectural components related to that. Historical or associative value. Some direct associations of something that's important in the community. And again, this focuses on each community having its own character and importance in relation to trees. Contextual value. Did it have some sort of a function? Was it a landmark? Bent trees were sometimes used to indicate trails. There's a number of different methods that were used back in the day. Summary of what we have currently. Generally, and again, some of the municipalities have been involved in designating heritage trees. Here's some examples of some of the trees that have been recognized already. So again, you've got something that was, again, a type of tree, eastern larch. It's not uncommon, but again, it's been associated culturally with the property. Any questions at this point? Okay. Again, a district where there was an area, a street that was important to the community, they would designate it as, again, this is under the Heritage Act. You would also have the opportunity through the planning department to implement these components if you've got a heritage area that you feel very strongly about. It is a planning tool to raise the bar in terms of what's going to happen within that district. Again, we've got a situation with the planting of the tree when George V, George VI, and Queen Elizabeth were here. Again, it's the association of an action of some people or individuals as related to the plantings. And here we have a hedgerow. We'll say orange. Gives a bit of a character to the location. Again, it's one of the 9 criteria. You've got streets, or again, a Heritage Conservation District, Harvard area in Toronto. A woodlot, Richelieu Park, City of Vanier. And again, this was to indicate that this stand of trees or grove of trees were important to the community and designation was sought for them. The value relating to the cultural aspect, as Edith spent years doing historical work and still doing historical research on this tree that you talked about. It takes time. There are opportunities through a number of different groups that have archived information about communities. Generally, in our older communities, the local newspaper generally archives pretty well everything in terms of historical information. Local library. Some of the more elder residents, more knowledgeable residents of the community are sometimes a wealth of information as well on what changes have occurred in the community. Having videotapes of those conversations about trees are sometimes important to benefit future generations. It's only recently that we've become more interested in documenting oral history. Has anybody had an oral history event yet, where somebody's talked to you in front of a camera and said, tell me a little bit about this, that, and the other thing? Not yet? It's important to document the information, definitely. I did that with my father when he was in his 70s, just to sort of get his war story, shall we say, documented on a videotape, and it was quite interesting. So again, oral history and video history is very important because it's a lot more difficult to try and write nowadays. Who can conduct the research? Again, it's all about building information. Small steps. And if you're interested in designating a tree under the Heritage Act, the steps have to be taken and they're not immediate. Again, anybody can conduct the research necessary to seek designation. In-depth research, again, different sources. Documentation. Another thing is assessing the tree as well. Its condition, those factors that Edith alluded to earlier in her designation in the tree. So again, primary sources, maps, books, archives, architecture, pictures of the properties when the houses were built. Sometimes architecturally they would make a picture of the house, plus they would put the landscape in as well. So that's sometimes important. Family photos, any number of circumstances. Secondary source, there could be other historical information through other organizations. Ontario Historical Society could be a potential source of information depending on the community. And where you can research. Has anybody ever been to the Land Registry office? My goodness, that's impressive. I'm impressed. That's something that most people don't usually visit. Archives, they're always interesting. I was up in the archives in Ottawa once. That was I managed to find a picture of Richmond Hill, which is where I live now. And it was taken from a plane in 1918 looking at Yonge Street north of Major Mackenzie. So it shows Yonge Street on the right-hand side, and the Church Street and some of the houses there. So again, there's a plethora of different archives. Because the boundaries tended to change with the municipalities over time, sometimes what is today one municipality was under a different municipality or township before that. So there's always movements of information between. I know in Richmond Hill before amalgamation, pretty well anything south of Major Mackenzie on Yonge Street was split between Vaughan and Markham. And part of the establishment of the regional government and the redefined boundaries inherited all those other properties. So again, you've got other sources. Google's probably the fastest one around. There's more information coming on stream all the time in that respect. And permanent records of the property. Again, the historical data, it's always important, even with the properties that you may own. I know friends of ours bought a house in Ingersoll, and it had a 3-page letter documenting the history of the house and all the changes that have occurred in the house. And the house was built in 1895. Well, I mean, but if it's something that once it's written, then it's just handed down for each of the owners after that. And it's not it doesn't take much. Taking a few pictures now and again. So again, this is sort of the first part of the presentation to get you an idea that there are opportunities under the Heritage Act. Any questions at this point in time? Yes?
Maybe it's a question for both of you. You talked a lot about existing trees and maintaining them and all that sort of thing. Is there an opportunity to harvest good seed quality from those trees? They obviously have very good genetics. It's much like fish restocking and whatnot that you tend to catch and release, and because those large older fish have really good genetics and they'll produce other good fish. Is there not a similar approach in terms of hanging on to heritage trees and whatnot, being able to harvest? And I listened to what Edith said, I thought it was very interesting. And I really thought she was heading in the direction that we took seedlings or we took growth suckers or something from those trees to perpetuate and continue that good breed stock in the area.
Well, I've been trying for years to get somebody to get that, like Mrs. Stone, let them get the seeds for years. And they said, do we'll do. No one has come. Read this riddle. It just flabbergasted me. And it is a propagator because every spring, all the neighbors have the little seedlings in their grass and they keep pulling them out and throwing them in the garbage. So I've tried, because I can only do so much, and Mrs. Stone was in her 80s at the time, we can only do so much. So it never happened with this tree. But there's a gentleman by the name of Stephen Smith who's so passionate about trees. If he knows about a healthy older tree, he'll go and he'll collect the seed himself. He'll just go and he'll get permission. He says, can I have your seed? That's how it's happening with me.
Doesn't that provide some rationale for maintaining some very old trees which are really healthy?
I know, and my father, who's a gambler, he said, why is this tree important? And I said, Dad, what was Northern Dancer like? And he goes, he was a stud. I think, he not think trees. And he says, the seeds. Yeah.
Yes.
I just want to say that I was talking to Guelph University about an elm tree that's on King Road, and they were not interested in that. They knew about that elm, but they said they weren't interested in it from a propagation point of view, but that they do have, I understood they had a seed bank.
Yeah, my understanding, and I've thought like you, my understanding is elm trees that have survived the Dutch elm, which is, that's why OEFC was established, is when you start them, they can get the Dutch elm disease.
Generally, Dutch elm disease usually doesn't affect the trees until they're about 25, 30 years old. So they become mature enough that they create seed. So even though the Dutch elm disease has been around a long time now, but it hasn't wiped out the elm. So it's taking time. As far as seed source collection, there is a seed bank in Ontario, As you probably know, I think there's one in Iceland as well, which is the international one.
Yeah.
But generally, it's up to the community to try and get the conversation started to say, we should have progeny from this tree. I mean, the Vimy Oaks is a good example of something where something was done in another country, in another continent, seeds were brought over here, trees were planted, and now many years later the seeds can go back. So I mean, there is opportunity in this respect that it's up to the community to try and make that important. The province is in discussions with shutting down the Angus seed bank at this point in time, which is a provincial-run organization. It's one of the things the Ontario Forest Council made a statement to the Premier about. We sent a letter last week. But again, it's about seed source, and the challenge now we're faced with is, with local seed, as we've learned with international trade, we sometimes get more than we bargained for. And if we start sourcing seed from outside, that becomes another misadventure potentially. But as far as seed source, it's really, if we can get a core group of people that's really interested in it, because you've got a small window of opportunity to actually feed seed, or get the seed, because squirrels usually get there first. So diligence is important. Yes?
Now, but I give you a little horror story. I just read that the Earth loses 63 billion tons of soil every year due to the use of overuse of chainsaws, you know. There's 63 billion tons of soil.
Yes.
That's all I'm going to say.
Soil is one of the key things that we need to survive. I mean, in the last decade, there has been a significant shift in the farming community on how they treat their fields. Only in the last decade in Ontario, last 15 years maybe. I mean, before, you used to have no stubble at all left in your cornfields. Now the stubble's usually this high or even higher. So again, there have been changes made and we're losing less soil, particularly in the wintertime when it gets really dry and there's no snow cover. It can move around a lot. Yes, it is a challenge. Soil retention is key.
Trees are the number one protectors of the soil.
Sorry?
Trees are the only protector of that.
Trees,
You know,
yes,
you know?
there were deserts in Ontario back in the 30s, as many of you probably know.
Oh, yeah.
Large areas of desert in Ontario through improper farming techniques of the earlier part of last century. And the only way that they overcame that was by planting trees. And that's why we have all the regional forests and county forests that we do have. They were planted originally to try to stop the movement of the sand at that point in time because the topsoil destroyed itself.
Don't plant back grass or graceful grass.
Yes.
Same thing in the Midwest, you know.
Yes, same, it mirrored in here in Ontario. Yes.
So just getting back to the bylaws,
Yes.
it seems to me we have two separate ones, a heritage house and a heritage tree, and they often go together. Has there been any municipality that's made it a sort of streamlined process so that a heritage tree, a house obviously has often the old trees beside it, or could they not be included in the same application?
The key thing is that we've got probably 30 acts that have trees in them in one various shape or form. As far as the Heritage Act goes, it's much easier to establish the property or the house, the structure, and put conditions on it. It's a little bit more difficult with the property. The one of the key challenge is that as far as designation of properties go, the property may become more challenged to sell in the future, because there's limitations usually placed on what you can do to that property. So it is a factor that has to be considered by the community or the owner of the property of that time. If I've got my 1863 house that was built way back when, and I want to seek heritage designation of it, there could be repercussions or other consequences that may not be apparent at the beginning. So that's something to consider, that there's sometimes limitations too when it comes to that. So it's something you have to balance. Yes?
I need clarification on that. I actually submitted a particular tree, the 170-year-old bur oak in Nashville, for heritage designation, which was accepted, and we're just waiting for our plaque.
Mm-hmm.
But it happened to be on municipal property, so I could do that.
Sure.
But I have many areas that I represent where they're not necessarily in a heritage district, but they do have heritage, well, what I would call heritage tree, anything over 100 years old. And I'm trying to understand though, I know with a house, it has to be the homeowner that designates the property or the house as heritage designation. the municipality really can't go in there and do it without their consent, because yes, you are affecting their property.
Well,
Without the homeowner's consent or
Okay,
the
I
property.
just want to address what you said about the structure of the house. My understanding of the Ontario Heritage Act redesignating a house, and because I was on the Western Historical Society, you don't have to get the homeowner's permission.
No.
You can go ahead and do it. You can have that, go ahead as an individual to have that house designated. Because where I live, that river mead, that architecture, Joyce Davidson, this gentleman, he was the architect. He also built B.P. Taylor's house, Bayview, and he also built W. Garfield Weston's house over here at Kleinberg, same architect. So this is the order of Catholic priests, and if it I'm gonna try and designate it myself, because I can do that because it's a house. But a tree is a different ballgame. We're still.
So you're saying you still need the property owner's permission?
You need the
Yeah.
property owner to agree a tree.
Yeah, you do not need the property owner's permission to designate the property. That's the bottom line in my understanding.
Yeah.
I have to look into that, because I
Yes.
sat on our heritage committee for 4 years, and we often struggled. We could try to bring it to a certain level, but the designation that really has value has to be done by the homeowner.
One of the challenges you run into is the municipality puts itself in a very awkward spot if it wants to designate a property. Municipalities are very shy of rezoning or redesignating properties against the wishes of the owner. I was involved in an OMB hearing where there was a case brought forward where the municipality asked the planning commissioner, well, why didn't you, if you knew all these options were available to this property owner and you wanted to limit the use of that lands to A, B, or C instead of A to Z, then why didn't you? And the planning commissioner basically said, well, we don't actively rezone property without the consent of the property owners. It's a quagmire that is very difficult to try and work through, because once you start rezoning lands without the owner's permission, you've taken away some of their rights. So, yes.
So, in King Township, we're not afraid.
Okay.
We designated shift, which is a piece of art in the middle of private land right here. And we've just started the process of designating a house against the will of the owner.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it is possible. It is possible. Again, it's up to the, shall we say, the members of the community and the support of the councillors that's key to initiate anything like that. So in that respect, there is a, if I may, I'd like to go on to the second part of the presentation.
Yes.
Oh, okay, don't worry about that. So what I'd like to do then,
You didn't have one on that list?
on the flashcard,
Oh, yeah.
but that's fine. Anyway,
Nobody put it in, I'll put it in.
all right, well, you can hold it for a minute, and I can talk a little bit more, yes.
Yeah, I was going to say that there is interest in just the process of leading to a tree bylaw that would be worked.
Well, okay, so,
But maybe that's part two.
well, no, I can start with that while you're,
Give me the disc.
yes. Now, I did do a quick, we'll do a quick dance right now.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. Bear with me for a second. I did, one of the key things that we have to look at the municipal world, and there's the private world, municipal world, there's government. I did do a quick scan of the township website, and you need foundation bylaws within the municipality that are usually based on community needs. Generally, if a community feels strongly about something, the municipality should be looking after, because the Municipal Act gives municipalities, the Municipal Act's probably about this thick. There's 444 municipalities in Ontario. Not all municipalities have passed all the bylaws based on each of the acts and regulations available. Generally, the primary focus of most municipalities is housing, work, and transportation. And community services and planning for schools, those are all, they all sort of drop down through the process. So as a municipality becomes more sophisticated or larger in population, the ability to provide services to its communities increases as well exponentially. So with a small municipality of 500 people, how many services can you provide? probably a limited number based on a tax base. So as populations increase, there's more opportunities to provide more services. So in terms of anything to do with trees specifically, really the municipality has to show an interest in the care and maintenance of their own trees by having a tree bylaw. In the parks bylaw currently it indicates that you cannot dig or remove any trees or plants outside of parks or community areas. I wasn't able to find anything specifically in the township that spoke to trees on streets in the right of way or ROW. So it really, the municipality has to get its house, in my opinion, get its house in order first. In order, what we think as a staff, that we've developed the competencies to properly address how to look after trees in-house. And then over time, as there's an interest in the community to introduce a bylaw on private lands, we would have the expertise necessary to review any of the permits coming in. You don't necessarily need a bylaw. There are a number of different strategies that can be used by the community. And it really comes down to what the community suggestion is to the councillors. And if then the councillors go to the staff and say, give us a palette of opportunities that we can address trees. One key thing I'd like to state is, you've got the Municipal Act, which is what municipalities are surviving under, and you've got the Planning Act, which give the tools to the municipality to address tree issues as well. If you haven't got a bylaw under the Municipal Act on private trees or on public trees, you can address having a policy for any applications being made under the Planning Act. Yes?
I'm a little confused. It sounds to me like you're saying that the municipality could have a bylaw to regulate trees on its own property.
Yes, it can.
But why would it need a bylaw for itself?
Because it gives the prescription of what should be done to the trees on the municipal lands. What it says is the commissioner is empowered to plant trees on the municipal right-of-way, look after those trees in the municipal right-of-way, and if needed, remove trees on the municipal right-of-way. That sets the template of what the responsibilities of the municipality are. Then it's up to the policies that are developed of how often will they prune, what types of trees they'll be using. Those types of criteria come later, but you need a foundation to lay on.
But they can have that anyway without a bylaw, right? I mean,
Well, you don't need, you can have a policy,
Right.
but the challenge is, if you've got a bylaw, council has to approve the bylaw. All members of council are aware of what the ramifications are when a bylaw is passed. A policy is less, shall we say, it doesn't have as much clout. It may be malleable, it may be a policy today, but somebody changes in government and they say, well, we don't need that policy anymore. It doesn't have the stability of a bylaw.
Typically bylaws though have a permitting process, right? In order to, so you want to take a tree down, I don't want to take over because
In private trees, yeah, you would put conditions in as to what the criteria would be.
But on the municipal property, there wouldn't be a permitting process, it would be more of a
Process.
There would be an accountability of the process such that if a municipality plants a tree, then they're responsible for it, and then they can be at least reporting on that. You know, how many years, every year, a council report would go forward, we planted 4,000 trees, and that was towards our official plan of trying to increase our canopy cover. Those are goals that we're trying to achieve. There's more clout with the bylaw.
So just one more thing,
yes.
Do you know if the region of York has one?
Well, York Region has a forest conservation bylaw
On
that only applies to lands, wooded lands, greater than 0.2 hectares.
No, I mean for municipal right-of-ways. So York Region right-of-way?
York Region right-of-way, they would have, yes, they have controls within their right-of-way.
A bylaw?
Well, their bylaw basically is more a trees on municipal road allowance.
Right.
So they do have, they have some, in other words, if you don't have a bylaw on the municipal road allowance, then if somebody plants a tree out in the municipal road allowance,
Right.
the municipality's stuck with it. Because that's another power the commissioner can say, only trees that are planted with permission of the commissioner in the road allowance will be allowed. And if anything else is planted in the road allowance, we have the opportunity to rip it out.
Well, they own the right-of-way, right? So
Well, they own the right of way,
they have
yes,
full
yes,
control.
but again, if you have again, we're talking about public trees only, we're not talking about private trees. So if you've got a public tree, you have the foundation, and then you have staff, or at least people who are able to administer how to cure trees and have tree knowledge. So that's one of the key things. Thank you, Edith.
No problem.
I will carry on a little bit. This will give a little bit more background, and there's a couple of slides we can use as talking points. So again, with a Heritage Act or other acts, this is sort of a pyramid of how you can control what happens to the trees. You've got zoning that's available to the municipality to restrict the use of what happens on those lands. Hazard lands are a pretty good designation, meaning that probably nothing's going to happen on those lands. Floodplain, anything of that nature. Municipal Act, Section 135 of the Municipal Act states specifically, to paraphrase, municipalities have the opportunity to pass a bylaw to restrict the removal of trees. I'm paraphrasing, but it's one sentence really, that gives the municipality the authority. The opportunity to list it under the Heritage Act, that buys you 60 days. Short term, just if there's a building that has historical context that the owner wants to demolish, if you can throw that in front of them, you buy 60 days worth of time to come up with other tools to try and prevent the loss of the building or the loss of the tree. Designated, again, this is where it comes up to a higher level of attention at the provincial level, where you get the minister involved. There's, again, a much longer process in this respect. Easements. Are many of you familiar with conservation easements? Has your experience been good or indifferent with conservation easements?
Horrible.
What is it that you didn't like about the conservation easement?
They get first say on everything. It messes up the planning process. It's there for a particular reason. Doesn't always run current with associated uses.
The premise behind a conservation unit was very big in the States, where you had a farm or a ranch that was 25,000 acres in size or 30,000 acre in size. If you had a conservation easement placed on it, then you get a tax benefit. The experience I've had with conservation easements, they became a planning tool to try and institute conditions on private lands and still achieve some tree retention in the process. The unfortunate part is the conservation easements are also usually managed by the municipality, which means the property owners don't necessarily tell the municipality they're doing anything in a conservation easement. And unless the municipality has access to the property to inspect it, the enforcement of conservation easements can become a challenge. That's part of the reason. Go ahead.
The Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust. So they work throughout King Township putting conservation easements through, and it's been very successful on large parcels of land.
Absolutely.
And the landowners reap a tax benefit.
Of course, they do. The context that I had been involved in, there were 5-meter wide strips in the backyards of people's houses for the width of their property, multiplied by all the way down the street. And then once there's no limitation, depending on how the easement agreement is written, the agreements that I was familiar with, you have the ability to put up a fence between the property lines, which means that access to those conservation easements disappeared once the fences went up. Because if you started at one end of the street and walked through the whole conservation easement, you're hopping 8-foot fences all the way along. There's some operational issues, definitely. So, conservation easements, they can protect trees. They are a technique, but then again, they do have some limitations, and it's all about the property owner and what type of a legacy they want to leave. That's what it comes down to. And then the top of the structure is, if you want to protect everything on the property, buy it. Or have it bequeathed. There's a couple of options that way. Yes?
I'm a bit confused. So with the same Heritage Act, with listing and designating a house, can be used for a tree as well?
It can.
Okay, well, that was our first question.
Well, it can, but it can be against the wishes of the property owner, but the challenge is to convince people that the tree on its own has the cultural aspect of it, is the challenge. If you've got a house that was built and a tree planted at the same time that was...
Oh, yeah. No.
But that's all I'm saying. Yeah, it's much more difficult to present. It's about... Here we've got the house.
Same legislation.
Yes. Well, the same legislation is used.
Okay, well, that was the
That's-
first question
Yeah.
that was asked, and I'm not sure that was the answer. Anyway, thank you.
So in essence, yes, if you have the case for the tree, you can use these tools.
Right, thank you.
Yes. Go ahead.
Peter, correct me if I'm wrong on this. A few years ago, two professors, married couple, Hillary and Stephen Sharper, they had a boundary tree in Toronto. The neighbor wanted to cut down, they did not. Well, they were so adamant, they wanted their tree saved. They took a second mortgage on their house, and they got Clayton Ruby, and they got Jack Radecki, who happens to be one of two arborists that has a license to go into a court. There's only two arborists in Ontario that have this special license, and they won. So my understanding of private boundary trees, that if your neighbor wants it cut down, and you don't want it cut down, they can't touch that tree, because the Sharpers went to Supreme Court, and they won their case. And they call it the Sharper Tree Boundary Law, but you can Google it, and you can see all this. And when I talked to Professor Sharper, he says, we have to put our money where our mouth is, and we needed the best, we needed a shark, and we got Clayton Ruby, and we won. So that's for all the people.
To preface what Edith is saying
Yeah, so
is,
that's why I wanted to-
their court case was specific only to the Forestry Act,
There we go.
which is another act that we haven't talked about yet at all. So, but they had agreed at the beginning of the trial to say we're only focusing on the definition of a co-owned tree. So there's two definitions. Forestry Act. The Forestry Act is 5 pages long, believe it or not. And the Forestry Act is based on silvicultural practices. Do we know what silvicultural work is or practices in that respect? Silviculture is to paraphrase, is the science and art of planting, managing, tending, and harvesting trees for commercial gain or a product. Arboriculture is the planting, care, management of single trees generally for the benefit of the property owner or the community, not for profit. So there's a big difference, and the Forestry Act is based on silviculture, arboriculture, two different fields, and there the twain shall meet, hopefully. Having said that, there are other options available for recognition. Forest Ontario, I guess I should change this soon, they changed their name not long ago. Forest Ontario does have a heritage tree program as well. The handbook that Edith had mentioned was developed to support that program. It's a commemoration only. It's not a recognition. These are some of the other ones. We touched upon these briefly. The Municipal Act, Section 135. It allows the renewal practices on private property as well as public property. 135 says, any trees in your municipality, you decide how you want to rate a bylaw. It's not a guarantee that trees will be protected. It allows for a permitting process or review. What it does is it stops or slows down the weekend warriors. Typically, when a new person moves into the neighborhood, they unpack. A month later, they fire up the chainsaw and say, we'd like to increase the view out of our backyard. And that's what a private tree bylaw would help to try and get them to stop and think and provide information before cutting down occurs. Yes?
Do you know if in those instances that so you got the weekend warrior,
Right.
but you do have a bylaw in place,
Mhm.
you know, those ones that like to seek forgiveness afterwards? So they chop the trees, even though there's a bylaw in place, you know typically what are the ramifications of doing that? Or is it just a fine, in which case it ends up being worthwhile to them to cut the tree down because the fine's so cheap?
I guess the question is on what scale you're talking about. If you're talking about the homeowner who bought the house that decided to cut the tree down.
Yeah, that's typically the problem that we're working.
If you are charged, you are a little bit shamed in your community that you weren't following the bylaw. So you've got the rest of the neighbors that you have to contend with. There's some social aspects of bylaws that have to be thought of as well. So there may be a pittance or there may be something, not a great monetary penalty, but at least there's a recognition that if it does go to court, and if it does go before a judge, the judge either agrees with the way the bylaw is written against the charge that was levied, and if they do fine the $50 or whatever the fine may be, whatever the minimum, whatever the JP decides, then at least the municipality has the confidence that the bylaw has been tested in court.
Mm.
A bylaw is only a piece of paper until it's tested in court. So it's important to understand that. So that's why York Region's been in court lots of times with their bylaws.
We have a lot of testers.
Well, if they go through the court system, then it just adds more credence to the next person who gets charged, the fines will sometimes increase. Because if there's been 15 charges in the township, and they're all publicly known, the new person who comes in and says, well, I didn't know there was a bylaw, well, but then there's, you know, here's all the information, why didn't you at least stop and ask?
Right.
So the onus is also on the property owner, but there are some people who will push the limits. We tend to do that sometimes. The program that I mentioned earlier was a collaboration of both organizations to recognize trees. Again, this is only a symbolic recognition, but each recognition that you have on a tree or on a property just adds more to the conversation. So the more layers of conversation you have, the more difficult it is to justify action on trees. The Planning Act. The town of Newmarket introduced a planning policy to address trees. They don't have a bylaw on private property. The planning policy has been around since I think 2000 and, let's see, probably 12 it's been effective in that respect, or at least implemented. Their planning policy says that once an application is made, they need an arborist report. They need an inventory of the trees on the property, they need a management plan for whatever happens to those trees on the property related to the development. It works, but if I was to buy the property, cut down all the trees, and then make my planning application, I'm clear. Because until I make a physical application to the municipality to say, I want to deal with my tree under the Planning Act, there's no other bylaw. So the Municipal Act and the Planning Act, if there's a bylaw on the private property under the Municipal Act, usually there's a policy that mirrors. Not many municipalities will pass on using the Planning Act, the bylaw, to say that we want to try and deal with trees in that area alone. Because again, you have to, until application is made for development, it falls under the Planning Act. Before, it falls under the Municipal Act. Yes?
The only thing that I would add to that is that through the course of the development application, in the instance where you're saying where they cut the trees down first and then they come to the development application, a development application represents a degree of leverage. And so, and because there's 10 years worth of, or more of aerial photography flown by whoever it is, Google or Region of York, that we can see the tree coverage that's on that property after the fact, after the development application is made.
Challenge you're faced with is, once an application is received by the township, the Municipal Act goes quiet because it's handled under
Now
the
it's
Planning
under
Act.
Planning Act, gotcha. Yep.
Once you're in the Planning Act bubble, if trees are cut down,
Yep.
until there's a signed subdivision agreement or site plan agreement, there's this area of flux, we'll call it.
Right.
And the problem is, during this area of flux, some property owners are a little more assertive in what they want to remove in advance of development. And the challenge is, during that flux period, how the municipality handles them as a developer.
Right.
And if they have repeat developments within a property, well, there should be some serious conversations on future applications.
Agreed.
One municipality took to, again, this is scoping it a little bit, but they were considering licensing tree services such that if they were hired by the developer that had a planning application in that municipality and cut the trees down before they got the approval, that if they had their tree services licensed, they could pull their license, so they wouldn't be able to work in the municipality. It's a sidebar approach, but again, it's about, if you do that here, the more layers you create, the more of a, shall we say, a more intelligent conversation you can have. So under the plan, again, Municipal Act, Planning Act, they're two different worlds. Once you're in the Planning Act bubble, you say goodnight to the Municipal Act.
Peter,
Yes.
I'm just wondering, are you saying that to be effective with a tree bylaw, you have to have that bylaw under, or does the municipality have to pass something under the Municipal Act and under the Planning Act if you want to kind of cover both ends? Or?
You can use the Municipal Act alone and develop planning policies. So hypothetically, we all would know what DBH is, 1.37 meters above ground, diameter breast height. If the community wants a bylaw that passes, say a 30 centimeter DBH, is about a foot, as the smallest trees that would be affected by a bylaw. Then in your planning policy, you would also ask for the same information that's mirrored in the bylaw. Again, if you've got a bylaw that specifies certain size of tree, then the planning policy usually mirrors that. Yes?
Sorry, I can't see if you're looking. Okay. Wanted to know if there's any bylaws regarding requiring a permit to cut or a permission, and the penalty therefore, would it be graded? Do they have any that's graded, so that a heritage tree or a very large tree, you just don't have the same fine for cutting down a two-foot diameter tree? And my thinking is you could look at the biomass for the work the tree does, cleaning the air, as well as the value and all the categories that label it heritage.
The fines are all specified by the province.
Okay,
So
there's
it's
only
whatever
one
the province says, they just recognize fines as set fines, up to a maximum, per shall we say, per case. But it's provincially dictated. The municipality can't just arbitrarily say, we want to pass a fine that if a tree is cut down that's greater than 20 centimeter DBH, there's a $100,000 fine. The province dictates what's the fines. Municipalities' hands are somewhat tied on that.
We're all treated the same.
Well, it's a contravention of a bylaw. So it has certain thresholds and criteria. So through the planning process, there are tools that the municipality can have. The challenge, of course, is you have to have the commitment of council and staff, and the competent staff that can address those issues. I did a presentation in North Kawartha, absolutely, on Emerald Ash Borer, and basically went through to the presentation to council, and the outcome was that the liaison on anything to do with Emerald Ash Borer in North Kawartha was a chief building official. So the question is, just because of the size of the municipality, they have 10 names to pick from, and they say, okay, guess what? You're getting this project. So it doesn't necessarily mean the staff are there that are competent and qualified to deal with an issue. It just that happens that they've got limited resources. And it comes down to if the municipality thinks that something's really important, then they have to hire the staff as well. And that's a challenge, of course, because it's always, well, if we're going to pass a bylaw that says we're going to look after our municipal trees, how much is it going to cost? Do we have to buy equipment? Do we have to contract it out? Then we need somebody to manage the contract. There's a whole plethora of different things that happen. And that's why a lot of the council reports, what's the financial implications to the municipality and for how long? So there are things that are important to understand. There's always, for every action, there's a reaction, principle of physics. Conservation Authorities Act, you do have a layer of the Conservation Authority here. So they have jurisdiction here on private lands for, shall we say, addressing some issues associated with floods and managing vegetation in those areas. So there is, again, the opportunity that they've got their top of bank map, their top of bank map mapping, so that if you go on the Conservation CRCA site, you punch in a property address and it'll give you the map to see if and what part of properties are under their authority. And if they're under their authority, they're regulated, you can't do certain things on the property that they regulate. Even though it's your private lands, they have authority under the Conservation Authority Act to address issues. Again, their primary concern is fill and cut. Planning Act, again, you've got a number of different applications that come in for a Planning Act, official plan amendment, rezoning, consent, severance, minor variance, site plan subdivision. Do you have a site plan control bylaw in King Township at this point?
Yes.
Okay, so you've got a designated area where you require a higher level of information.
Yep.
So you do have that tool. Some municipalities threw site plan process away because it was too cumbersome. But the problem, the benefit of a site plan is you take a certain geographic area, a block area, and say, okay, in this area, almost mirroring a heritage conservation type of an approach, you can ask for more information. You can ask for landscape plans, tree reports, grading plans, full site plan application, knowing that up front. So it's important, again, the key thing is on the applications for the municipality, if you've got information you're seeking on the application form, then it sets the tone for the application. To give you a case in point, I did a presentation in Peterborough, talked about bylaws. No disrespect to Autonomy Conservation Authority, but on their application form for work within their Conservation Authority lands, they didn't even talk about vegetation or trees on the application form. We're looking for a report on the vegetation on your property. If you've got that on the application form, then it means that someone will eventually review it. But if it's not on there, you can't ask for it later. There is in King, there is one, the municipal access agreements. Is anybody familiar with municipal access agreements? Municipal access agreements is a relationship between the utilities, the electricity, the gas, the communications, and the municipality. And those municipal access agreements set certain terms and conditions. In the municipal access agreement, it does state that if there's work to be done around a tree, that the contractor should try and avoid damaging those trees. It at least starts the conversation. And the more places you have trees identified on municipal applications, the more opportunities you have those conversations. There is a site alteration bylaw in King Township. It does require trees over 250 centimeter caliper to be identified for any site alteration applications.
Would that be for Siberian elm and Manitoba maple and all that stuff?
It doesn't say anything about specifically about trees. One thing you got to understand about trying to limit trees, some municipalities pass bylaws and say we don't like certain trees.
Absolutely.
One challenge is it may limit your opportunity to revegetate some lands that may be challenged. In other words, Carolina poplars, some people would try and like to get rid of Carolina poplars, but if you've got an old dump site, if you've got questionable soils, the cost of planting Carolina poplars next to nothing. Willow, same thing. So I mean, you got to think about it when it comes to certain sites in the municipality. So as far as, if I could just step back, so again, I emphasize here that the Municipal Act, if you have a bylaw under the Municipal Act, you have planning policies that can mirror. And at least have a conversation on how to address trees more cohesively. Yes?
I noted in Bill 139, which I keep referring to, the OMB Reform Act, there's actually a sentence in there that talks about tree canopies. Has anybody been able to sort of understand where they're looking to go with that?
Tree canopy really, again, the province sometimes passes acts that says, here's our goal, you figure it out at the local level. To give you a case in point, tree canopy, I did a presentation down in St. Catharines, and trying to increase tree canopy in the Niagara region is a bit challenged right now because everybody's got a vineyard. So it's a trade-off. So there's no set formula. It depends on the community and what they envision. I mean, when you're talking about communities that have been farming communities for the last 250 years, the transition back to a wooded is a greater opportunity than if you've got already a well-developed subdivision that's got already large trees in it. So I mean, it depends on the community. As far as percentages go, official plans usually set the tone of what the municipality wants to set in terms of canopy cover. So if the King Township in their official plan says, one of our goals is to achieve hypothetically 30% canopy cover by 2050, then that's in the official plan. So when reports are written to emphasize the importance of tree planting programs, it can refer back to the official plan to say that we're trying to achieve goal of 2050. So I mean, the key thing is the official plan sets the tone for development in the municipality. And how frequently are official plans supposed to be rewritten? Does anybody know?
5 years?
5 years. 5 years. No disrespect to Richmond Hill, but they had an official plan. Their official plan was 1982. The OMB hearings that I used to attend on occasion, the presentation would be made, yes, it was passed in 1982, this is in 2005, say, passed in 1982 with 163 amendments. Every time you amend an official plan, you deflate the balloon a little bit, because it means that there's an anomaly. And every time there's an anomaly, the footing of the municipality before the OMB becomes much more on quicksand. Because once the earth shifts beneath them, it's much more difficult. If you've got a hard and fast official plan, the council is willing to stand up with and support staff, then it sets the tone for the development. I mean, Hazel McCallion, she trained the developers really well, really early, back in the 60s. Once they got developing in Mississauga, not that she found out afterwards what she was thinking didn't quite work out for the benefit of everybody, because it just turned out to be a car heaven, I guess you could say, but at least she trained them all early. So she got a lot of services from the developers early on. The challenge we're faced with in the York region, there's a number of developers that own substantial amounts of lands in this municipality or in this township or in the York region. So there's a few big players. And generally once there's a big player that owns land, other people like to buy next to them because they can get the benefit of whatever happens on that property. So it is important to understand there are protections out there. If you have a bylaw looking after municipal land and municipal trees first, you have a foundation and some staffing. To develop a bylaw on private lands before the municipality has their house in order is a tough sell. Because if there's going to be any cost for permits, the municipality looks a little bit awkward. I'm being frank here. That they're telling the private homeowner they're going to pay to get a permit to remove a tree on their land, and there's no recognition of the municipal trees or care and maintenance of them. So it's a balancing act. It depends on what the priority and foundations. Yes?
So that's interesting. So I'm just wondering, I'd like to see a municipal bylaw that deals with trees on municipal lands.
Mm-hmm.
And where my mind's going with that is typically some of these plans, if we talk about Oak Ridge's Marine Plan or in terms of government and how the government deals with infrastructure, that if there's an area that is right in the core of the Oak Ridge's Moraine, but if the province or municipality needs infrastructure, the infrastructure trumps any of the provisions of the Oak Ridge's Moraine. So I'm wondering if the same sort of thing would apply in terms of trees, that you've got trees on the municipal right-of-way, and we have a bylaw for the municipal right-of-way. However, if that municipality needs to do something from an infrastructure perspective, that would trump anything in regard to protecting the tree.
Well, if there's
Especially if it's something for, health and safety or whatever, right?
Well, if there's a bylaw that recognizes the importance of trees on public lands, the municipality has that card to speak to whoever's putting in the infrastructure that, okay, you may want to put this infrastructure down the street, but give us the arborist report on how you're going to deal with the issue.
Right.
And if we're going to lose an asset, it's going to cost you this much money to replace it, or you have to plant so many trees.
Yeah.
It gives you at least a tool to have a conversation. If they're not identified in a bylaw, it's more just a conversation between you and I saying, well, okay, we got to put this sewer down the middle of the road, the developer's going to have benefit 3 kilometers away, and then we go into the boulevard and there's a whole row of silver maples that are growing there that have been there for 60 years. Well, if there's no bylaw to protect them, then really it becomes a conversation. Yeah. And engineering staff are usually the ones that are first and foremost to receive those types of applications. So again, engineering staff being at least understanding of the impacts on the vegetation of the area. Again, most of the servicing, one of the challenges you run into is, particularly with development applications, it's not so much what happens on the lands themselves, but it's the half-kilometer water main long that comes in from some other subdivision that's got to connect up, and everything in between that those property owners all of a sudden get their front yard ripped up because of a development 2 kilometers away. Mm-hmm. And they're just sort of, unfortunately, like collateral damage. It just happened to be in the way of what infrastructure is being installed. But again, if there is something on the road allowance, you have a tool to have a conversation.
So we tried to get one in King, a tree bylaw for
Yes.
private property, but based on what you're saying, it sounds like maybe we put the cart before the horse, that we should be looking at a municipal bylaw for municipal rights of way, get that in place, and then look at the private property side.
It develops a competency of the staff to address any tree issues.
Right.
When I was in Richmond Hill back in the 80s, we were the go-to department, all the other departments, because there's only 2 of us. We had all the tree issues come to us. We didn't have to go looking for them, so the legal department, planning department, building, clerks, everybody would come to us and say, well, what do we do about this tree issue? And then we'd give them some sort of an answer based on the legislation we had available. And I mean, in our case in Richmond Hill, it's fortunate that back in 1975 was when the original bylaw was passed to form the forestry section. And there's been revisions since then, but sort of the reality is you need something to build on.
Yeah.
And I did this presentation in Selwyn, which is Lakefield. They were talking about the same thing, passing a bylaw on private property, well, but they didn't have any on municipal lands to start with. So that puts the municipality in an awkward spot because they're enforcing a private tree bylaw, but why they may not have staff that are able to interpret the arborist reports. then you don't want to be in a position of getting stuff coming in that somebody looks at and says, well, I know nothing, I'm just going to get it passed.
Well, your point about this is, if I think back in terms of our site alteration bylaw, which was passed in 1998 or 1997, that bylaw was passed and handed to the building official, who knows really nothing about site grading or site alteration. So we had a bylaw in place, but not the expertise in-house in order to do that.
But now I think the bylaw falls under the engineering department, if I'm not
It
mistaken.
does, so it's been since amended and much better administered now.
But 60 cubic meters is still sort of an interesting question, because I didn't really quite understand the site alteration bylaw. Basically, site alteration is mean changing the grades. You either cut or fill.
Right.
Add material or take material away.
Right.
I didn't quite look through the whole bylaw itself, but 60 cubic meters is what is the low threshold. Before 60, if you have 58 cubic meters of material brought onto the site,
You don't need a permit.
you don't need a permit.
Right.
Well, a 50-foot lot,
It doesn't
by
apply.
120, I don't know how much of a change that would be, but I would
That's a massive change in a subdivision.
but subdivision is under the Planning Act.
I'm
That's
talking-
supposed to be engineered.
I'm talking about a 50-year-old subdivision.
Okay, 50-year-old subdivision granted, yes, yeah. No, so that's what I'm saying, that, well, bylaws in some cases are passed reactively. City of Toronto private tree bylaw was passed reactively, back in the mid-90s. There was somebody who was cutting down trees in Hyde Park. They didn't have any legislation in place to protect private trees, so they used the Municipal Act, said, okay, we're gonna pass a bylaw, but they didn't have any staff. That were really, it was just to stop a problem.
Right.
And I mean, since then it's built, because obviously Toronto set the tone and a lot of other municipalities have passed bylaws. So there's more conversations being had on how trees are being addressed in the municipalities. So, yes.
Yeah, I have a question for you folks up here. In Toronto, we have the private tree bylaw, but also, if you have property backing onto a ravine, and like there's a creek below, top of bank, if you cut trees on, that's TRCA
Yes.
responsibility.
Yeah.
And as soon as I hear the saw going on any of the banks on St. Lucie Drive, I phone up TRCA, because, and so do you have the same thing
Yes,
up
it's,
here?
it's within the regulation area of the Conservation Authority. So King is
Okay,
split
good.
by TRCA and LSRCA,
Okay.
but the same applies within their regulated area.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Correct.
So again, there are a number of tools that the Ontario Open Forest Council, as I mentioned earlier, we've done a presentation to a couple of other municipalities. We do offer a program for municipal staff. What we're talking about here is a little mini presentation that we usually do to the community. But basically, it's just to sort of reinforce the Planning Act and Municipal Act. But the OUFC does have a program where we will come to a municipality and do a presentation to their staff on what their existing legislation is and what are some of the tools available to them. And then the municipality can decide how they want to proceed. You're right, 2014 there was a private tree bylaw discussion, but I respectfully say that if there's a bylaw to be written, it should be a bylaw that is written by a practitioner or an operations person that helps operationalize the bylaw. I was involved in a program where a section of the municipality wrote a report, but they wrote the report and basically washed their hands of it. Once council passed the report, all the responsibilities were designated over 4 other departments. So generally, you'd like to have the department that's going to be looking after it write the report. And also, if you are contemplating, if there was discussion about a private tree or a public tree bylaw, that's almost an internal conversation and an education process for the residents to know that they're not supposed to plant on the road allowance. Because one of the biggest problems we used to run into is people like the landscape right up to the curb. Because on their survey, there's a black line that shows where their property is, and it's right there at the curb, isn't it? Well, that's what they kept telling me anyways. But that black line is not the curb, it's in subdivisions usually 3/4 of a meter behind the sidewalk if there is one. So again, the thing is that with a public tree bylaw, if that was something to be pursued, it should be a multi-departmental committee that reviews the operational issues for those other departments. Because any building permits that would come in would also have to have somebody saying, do you need a report, arborist report, or not? That checkbox has to be looked at for any applications coming in through the planning department. If the engineering department's doing infrastructure, well then they should be cognizant of the fact that there's certain tree conditions and criteria that should be followed as well. Trees at some point in time impact all operations within a municipality. At some point in time. The duration could be overnight where it's a water main break. trees over top of it, the tree's gone, then you replant later on, or it could be more longer term in some of the planting stuff. So again, it's up to the community to decide with the support of council. Yes?
Thank you for your answer earlier about the province really dictates a permit can only be really one price. But I wanted to know, is that similar or considered separate for punitive? The punishment, the shaming of a developer or someone who wants to just do it first and ask for forgiveness. If we make it expensive, I mean, again, the biomass of a large tree, you could say, well, so many smaller trees would have to be planted to make up for that one, and then knowing maybe only a third make it to 2 decades old, you have to plant 3 times that.
Yeah.
That drives the price up and makes it a little more of a deterrent, I should think.
If there's...
Is there something limiting?
If there's wording in the bylaw that says replanting programs may be required, or there could be other penalties, non-monetary. Again, it depends on what you write into the bylaw.
Okay.
There's flexibility. Again, section 135 basically says you have the opportunity to address trees on both public and private lands. You as an individual, township, or municipality decide how you want to address it. Again, another thing I want to differentiate is the Forest Conservation Bylaw, which is administered by York Region, and a municipal tree bylaw. Forest Conservation Bylaws, as I mentioned earlier, specific usually to wooded land, or sections of woodlands that as a group could be over 3 or 4 properties. But because it's contiguous, the Forest Conservation Bylaw doesn't recognize property lines. So it basically means that if there's 3 or 4 properties associated with a woodlot, you look at the entire woodlot, not the property itself. So that's, again, a way to tweak things when it comes to interpretation. So, again, yes?
Here's another question for you. So, Region of York has the forest conservation bylaws that you're talking about, and I think they deal with woodlots up to a certain size, whatever it is, 2 hectares.
About 2 hectares and greater.
But then we have these properties that have significant, it's hard to call them forests, but there are significantly wooded areas that are below that threshold. So then does that fall into, because what we looked at in 2014 was a single tree bylaw, I think, or you know, in trying to take control of tree removal on private property. But I guess this would fall under the same sort of bylaw, but it would capture like X number of trees per, per hectare, or?
In the Forestry Act, it defines a woodland.
Right.
And if you have 1,000 trees per hectare of any size, that means it would be woodland.
Right.
As far as private tree bylaws go, really it's open season. Some municipalities, you can take down 5 trees a year before you have to apply for a permit for the 6th one.
So you could take down 10 in 2 years.
Exactly. So again, when you hear the term private tree bylaw, it's a bit of a misnomer, because if you're going to take down 5 trees and not apply for a permit, well, so you're right. You take down 10 trees over 2 years, and you're outside of the radar of the municipality.
Yeah.
If there's somebody who cut down 7 trees, then they could be charged under the bylaw. And again, it's up to the municipality to decide how much resources they want to put into. But one of the key things when we passed the bylaw on Richmond Hill, I originally started with 30 centimeters as the prime because of the city of Toronto. Council, in a workshop we had, said, no, we want 20. What it meant was that we just all of a sudden absorbed about 20% more trees under the bylaw. Because again, depending on where all your planting is taking place, you have to have a sense of the age of the communities you're dealing with. If you've got subdivisions that are just being built now, if they plant their landscape today, they won't fall under any bylaw even at 20 centimeters, probably for 15 or 20 years before they even have to apply. So again, it depends on how the development's grown and when the tree planting occurred. Back to the heritage districts. You can have site plan districts, as you've mentioned. There are some. If you want to pass a specific heritage area bylaw related to trees, you can use the current, shall we say, envelope to introduce a private tree bylaw within those areas specifically to give some control to the municipality, but not necessarily across the entire county. Yes?
What would be your perspective on the challenge in Keene, where we have both subdivisions, old subdivisions, and we have vast rural areas? So in 2014, our effort at a tree bylaw is, it was one tree bylaw that was going to encompass all of Keene.
Right. If you try and broad brush the whole process for everybody, you've got quite a difference in clientele. You don't necessarily want to introduce roadblocks for the farming community. So you have to balance it between where are your critical areas you're having your problems. Identify those, and then see what options you have to try and address trees in those areas. I wouldn't say necessarily look at the whole picture, because even when those lands are coming up for rezoning, the large tracts of land, they do have to go through a process. And that's where your planning conditions can set out, we're looking for an arborist report, we're looking for details on trees through the planning process. So I mean, even without a bylaw, you can ask for that.
Right.
But I mean, again, the gap is they can bulldoze all the trees on the 200 acres before they make application if you don't have a bylaw. So again, if you want to start small, focus on your areas. That's where sort of having an idea of the inventory of what trees you have and where they are is a good starting point. And if council's getting a lot of attention in one particular neighborhood of trees disappearing all the time, well, maybe that would be your first start of conversation on how to address it. Education programs are important too. Again, new people move into the area, you have sort of a welcoming committee, say, or people you speak to them and say, these are some of the things that are important in our community. And if trees is part of the conversation, it sets the tone for those new people coming in. When I was involved in the development process, I mean, everybody who moves into a new subdivision is a pioneer. They're moving into an area, they don't know where the cleaners are, they got an idea where the school is, they know where the arena is, they know where the dance studio is, but they got to learn all that stuff. It comes with time. And during those first 3-6 months, they can get a sense of what's important to the community by having some sort of an organization or an opportunity where you can speak to them and say, welcome to the community, here's where everything is, and by the way, this is important to us as well. Yes?
How about an educational program for the developers?
No disrespect to the councillors here, or any politicians here. One of the things that I find sort of a bit of a gap is that if I'm a federal politician, nobody can approach me directly to have a conversation about anything. At the provincial level, I have a bit of a thinner shield, where the time that you can speak to me as a provincial minister is usually at a social function where there's a table of other people and we have a conversation. At the municipal level, there's no real rules other than the ethics committee within the municipality. The challenge is that there was one municipal politician in Toronto many years ago who had a table set aside for him every day by a developer, and they'd have lunch every day. And subsequently, when there were some improprieties found and some charges laid, when it went to court, the developer said, well, I treated him like my son. We had lunch every day. What's wrong with that? It just depends. The problem, one of the challenges is municipal politicians are very accessible.
Well, on those 3 bylaws, that's tigers without teeth.
Sorry?
My opinion is that all those 3 bylaws are tigers without teeth.
I agree.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that.
All this stuff,
I wouldn't say that. I would say that if you don't have a bylaw, you have nothing to talk
It's
about.
about trying to get one bylaw that has teeth, okay?
Well, the bylaws are acting as a tool because as part of the passing of a bylaw, you have an education program, to your point, about an education program for developers. Well, you need an education program for the homeowners to know that what tools are available to them to take the developers to task.
And I suggest
But
you
it's
go
a
to
learning
Europe and
process.
check out the bylaws there. You know, you take a tree down in a little tree, and paid $150,000 to transplant that tree over Curry. There was no saying, oh no, we can do it, okay? The law can be done, but we that time we've got enough backbone, no teeth. That's my opinion.
You need the expertise
Exactly.
to enforce the bylaw because, again, as I mentioned, until the bylaw is recognized in court, you need the people to testify to the bylaw. So you need the experts to say, this was the tree, this is how it was, this is the condition, this is the history, this is the species, and the judge then makes a decision. Yes?
Simple question. Before we were talking about where in some municipalities they require the arborists or the tree cutter downers or whatever they're called, to have a license to work in the municipality. We have a 2-tier municipality. Is there some advantage to work, if York Region were to have such a thing, should we work with that? Or we're not disadvantaged if King were to do it and not York?
To be honest with you, the licensing of tree services would be preferred at the provincial level,
Oh, yeah.
only because it's like the pesticide ban, cosmetic use of pesticide ban. You remember when that was passed? The reason the province got, in my opinion, the reason the province got involved in that one was every municipality had a different take on how to approach it. Some passed bylaws, some had policies, you didn't know which side of the street what you were doing. It got to a point where it was just such a mishmash of concepts relating to pesticide use, that the province said, we got 100 municipalities that have 100 different rules. Nobody can manage that. So the province steps in and says, okay, this is the blanket for everybody. I would see the same thing happening with private tree bylaws. As more bylaws are passed, then there's going to be more, unfortunately, mishmash depending on the community. And the province may at least try and address it. In the Moat Bridges Moraine Act, there is a clause in there that the minister may empower municipalities to pass private tree bylaws. That's the only act I've seen so far where the province has actually mentioned tree bylaws. But that's specific only to that geographic area. Yes?
Just as a follow-up, an example, we have a wood lot or land protected under York, back of my house. I hear this chainsaw, a neighbor has decided to clear out trees on his land. He may or not be truthful when he was claiming ignorance of his land being a tree woodlot requiring York Region arborists to come. But what really got me was the man cutting it down in his company. Were claiming also that they didn't know, and I kind of felt they ought to.
Well,
so I just wonder how we can, I guess as a community here, we should be able to at least make sure our neighbors are aware.
Again, it's about education of the property owners, and tree services sometimes make a decision as to, well, I can either take some money and plead ignorance, or I can say no. So they have to make a business decision. As far as the York Region bylaw goes, usually there's a prescription written for what's to happen in that woodland. In other words, you can remove certain trees under a certain formula. So if there is a prescription that's been written for harvesting, then the property owner would just show that and say, here's my prescription, I'm following the rules. If they've not even done any of that, well then that's a conversation for York Region to have with the property owner. Yes?
I just want to make a last comment about the heritage aspect of trees. This cultural business. Does a tree not speak for itself? Why does it have to have a big list of people's history? Like it's not fake news looking at a tree. I mean, it's there, it's big, it's all that it is. And I just take issue with it's only important if it has this people history attached to it.
And I agree.
Can you read this quote in this book, The Secret Life of Trees? Read it.
So,
everybody would read it.
That's what I'm doing.
So what, again, as we mentioned at the beginning of the slides, one condition of the 9 have to make a tree attainable for that. It's just, what I'm saying is, if you have an ability to, really it comes down to marketing, the significance of this tree as a standalone tree on its own. If you can get it through all of the hoops to try and bring it to greater recognition, then all the more power to you. It's just that the more information you have that bolsters that conversation, the more, because a lot of people don't necessarily understand the value of the trees. No disrespect to politicians, but the politicians have a breadth and scope of issues that are brought forward to them that's this wide. The trees may only be this small segment of it. So it's difficult for a politician to try and balance out all the needs, wishes, and wants of the community in that respect. And if it comes down to trying to sell a tree just on its own, then you can certainly try.
I'm talking about a tree in King Township. It's on the carrying place, it's on the Hunter River, but it's sort of in the rural area, and there was no interest much because nobody, it wasn't on the people scale, or the people, whatever.
Sometimes we have to recirculate things back a few years. Take what we learned before, tried, didn't succeed, bring it back again.
That's right.
You always just have to continue to keep
It's
trying.
just what you said, if I had started to do this presentation.
And then I'm gonna say a few words. I have to say a few words, and if they're gonna stick around for a little bit, so you can rush them and ask the questions, okay?
All right, I'm ready.
Hey, Peter, do you have a sample, an example of a tree bylaw municipal that might be sort of appropriate for kind of reason? And obviously, downtown Toronto isn't that.
I have to emphasize again what we said earlier, each community is its own, and really it means having a conversation with what the people are interested in and what the politicians are able to facilitate, and trying to find a compromise between. If it's going to be the 30 centimeter, 20 centimeter, 2 stems, you're going to remove a year, 1 stem, single tree bylaw, that comes down to really the municipal.
Yes, but the framework and the, what topics are in it and that kind of thing.
A lot of that stuff is cut and paste from other bylaws.
Oh.
Except for you just fill in what you want for your own. There's specific exemptions that have to be met. Those are straight out of the act, because the Municipal Act of 135 says you can have a bylaw, but these are the exemptions. If a surveyor comes down your property line, they can cut down all the trees on your property line. They won't bother because it's too much work for them, but they'll do the offsets instead, but there's a number of exemptions. A lot of it's cut and paste, and it's about who's responsible for what. That's the preamble of the bylaw. The backing of why we're passing the bylaw, who's responsible, the definitions, what we're trying to do, what powers do we have, and then what are the penalties if they're not followed. It can be done. Yes.
Thank you. It's so great to see some of that interest. Don't get up though until I tell you. I'm not going to keep you long. I know you're dying to get at some of our refreshments and everything, and to talk to us and to talk to these folks. But first off, Bruce, you want to give
Anyway, first of all, Edith and Peter, I'm going to just say, you both have passion for your talk. There is no question. And it just gives inspiration, just real genuineness to what you talk about. So I just want to express that. I'm sure there's tons of other questions. I'm grateful to our members of council who are here.
Yeah.
I think we've all learned a lot, and great. I have a little gift. Ideally, I would have had something that comes from a tree, but it does come from plants. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Okay? So, and Greg's got a couple more things to say, but I know Peter and Edith will be glad to answer questions afterwards, too.
Yeah.